Welcome to the show. This is the Religion Otherwise podcast show, and I have a wonderful and distinguished guest, and I would go so far as to say not just colleague, but friend in religious studies and in theological education, Dr. Catherine Keller. And let me just sort of read a little bit about her just to give the audience some orientation to who Dr. Keller is. And I want to call her Catherine. She's allowing me to call her Catherine, just to give a sense of the work that Catherine has done. And then we're going to launch into this conversation. Catherine Keller practices theology as a relation between ancient hints of ultimacy and current matters of urgency. As the George T. Cobb Professor of Constructive Theology in the Theological School and Graduate Division of Religion at Drew University, she teaches courses in process, political, and ecological theology. Within and also beyond Christian conversation, she has all along mobilized the transdisciplinary potential of feminist, philosophical, and pluralist intersections with religion. Catherine is the author of numerous books, so I won't be able to go through all of them, but just to give you a little hint, and we're going to talk about some of the books and the work she's done, but to give a little hint of the books that she's published, and I'll have some of these in the link to the description, linked up in the description. She's the author most recently of Facing Apocalypse, Climate Democracy, and Other Last Chances. The author as well of Political Theology of the Earth, Our Planetary Emergency and the Struggle for a New Public. She's the author of Intercarnations, on the Possibility of Theology, author as well of Cloud of the Impossible, on the Mystery Discerning Divinity and Process. She's the author of Apocalypse Now and Then, as well as the book Face of the Deep and others as well. So I want to welcome you, Catherine, to this show, to this conversation, to this endeavor of mine to try and find a way, present a way to talk at high levels about religion and theology and what they mean for the present, but to do so in such a way that they become, shall we say, reachable to people with an interest in such themes and topics. And so, again, I want to welcome you to the show as we launch in this conversation, a conversation that we carry out against the backdrop of a number of difficulties and crises, the political challenges we're facing right now, Christian nationalism as we're facing it right now, and then the planetary ecological crisis as we face that as well right now. And you are well positioned to speak to such matters. So welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dr. J. Kameron Carter. And since you're Catherine, I get to call you J.
Indeed, please do.
Really honored to be on this show with you and to, in some way, participate in this communicative force field that you're unfolding. So I look forward to our conversation.
Fantastic. Well, we talked off camera, but also by email. And I just want to sort of just bring the audience into how I thought we might frame our conversation. And maybe we can do it by first inviting you to say a bit more about your own work as a scholar, as an intellectual. And then after you sort of lead us into that, I thought that a good way to perhaps orient the audience to the conversation would be to think about your work in relationship to three of your books in particular. In my head, at least, I've been thinking about the books in terms of how your work offers an alternative interpretation and approach to the Bible, to Christian scripture, to the Bible as a religious text in Christian communities and beyond. Particularly, I'm thinking of your book, Face of the Deep, A Theology of Becoming, in which you offer a profound and beautiful interpretation of the book of Genesis, and particularly the creation accounts in Genesis. That was the book that I first came to know Catherine Keller, and I was blown away. I talked about this book to a number of my friends, not just in theological education, but as I was increasingly in conversation with people in Black studies and Afro-American cultural studies and critical theory. I was talking up this book, and a number of my friends in Black studies started reading Catherine Keller. And so that was my entree into Catherine Keller. And then most recently, your book, Facing Apocalypse, which is also on climate change, democracy, and the convergence of these issues of last chances, apocalypse. And here you give a reading of the other end of the Bible, the book of Revelation, John's writing. And then between those two, you give this powerful meditation on our earth and ecological catastrophe, the book called A Political Theology of the Earth. So I thought that we could orient our conversation around those texts, bookended by your reading of the Bible. But let's start by you just saying a little bit about your own kind of intellectual journey, your work as a theologian.
Thank you. It's always amusing, but maybe a little amusing for me to try to understand again that journey. Because, of course, the journeys start very young and quite unconsciously. So mine started in a situation with absolutely no conventional Christianity or regular church or anything like that. My parents were sort of disenfranchised, disconnected existentialists, I would say. My mother read a lot. My stepfather had lost his mind in the war, so he couldn't. So, it was chaotic. Couldn't keep jobs. I mean, it was very chaotic, and we moved all over the place. But sometimes we landed in beautiful places, like we were in Athens, Greece, for almost 4 years.
Wow.
So that helped me sort of get a handle on Greek mythology and philosophy in some prime. So I was too young to read it still. So there was a lot of unsought after mobility, but with my mother, still a sense of search and meaningfulness. And she kept reading, didn't have degrees or a career or too many kids and too much survival at stake. But yeah, the questions did around her and in the instability of our life. So I think it's no coincidence that then I ended up in seminary, UCC seminary, when we were in St. Louis. My father had briefly a job at a church. He could do lots of things from his background in Europe, degrees. That didn't last, but my adventure in theology did, because it's the same time that feminist theology was just getting started, and it didn't have a foothold at my seminary there. So that was very helpful for me to find a setting in which I sort of had permission, rather aggressively, for feminist issues, but because there was ability to liberation theology already in that seminary. We're talking the late 1977. Sorry, that's when I went to doctoral school, around 74. So the mid-70s.
Interesting. Yes.
Yeah, so there was that sensibility. So there was space for my looking into what there was of feminist theology, later Rosemary Ruther, to try to construct my own, even experimenting with female images of the divine. Soon finding my way into a deep relationalism that found an important force to press against the separated, divide and conquer ethos of our patriarchal civilization. And there was developing some feminist sense of this relationality. And I think From a Broken Web, my first book, my dissertation, helped to develop that sense that there is a radical relationality, a sense of the interconnectedness of bodies that's mostly repressed, suppressed, and exploited in civilization as we've known it. But I found some support, and I found especially some support then in process thought, process theology.
Yes.
Ended up in Claremont, and there you have a whole worldview developed from that philosophy of Whitehead.
Right.
And back in the 20s, 30s, a whole vision of everything as intricately connected to its neighbors, neighborhood, to all the neighborhoods finally of the universe. Very different degrees of influence. And in that interconnectedness, also a dynamism of continuous becoming with a certain open end. So there was no excuse to just get trapped in the relation that formed us, because we could open ourselves to fresh ones, to new ones, and help others to do so. So that process theology,
Yes.
everything, not just humans, but all critters, a kind of earth process together, embedded in a process together, inspired me for the rest of my life, and still is with me. So that cosmological sense, connectivity in becoming, then is a kind of supportive world base ground from which then to pursue more critical endeavors.
Yes.
where we see the hierarchy of separations pitting one against the other, taking particularly troubling form as it is in our nation.
Mm-hmm.
Let me not just go on, which I could, given the breadth of your question, but why don't you
No, this is really, 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 really nice. I mean, that backdrop I think is important, because it seems to me that already your thought is emerging inside of the context of a kind of revolution of thought in the wake of important era of the 60s, like kind of symbolized by 19 just in the US, but worldwide, where 1968 is that moment, from the US to France, really globally, where people are trying to imagine alternative ways of being with each other beyond structures of war, beyond structures of patriarchal domination. What might it mean for us to be with each other differently? And what are the forms of thinking that go along with this? We're going to need new forms of thinking, or what we scholars sometimes use in our nice language. We're going to need new epistemological frameworks, new frames of knowing, which themselves have to be relational. And I sort of hear you talking about your work as emerging in the cauldron of those efforts that in many respects are still being worked out.
That's putting it very lucidly. Thank you. And that working out from my life, then, that allowed a focus on relations in becoming, and the becoming of relations, and relations with relations with relations, so we can never just isolate ourselves into our nice one-on-one relations.
Yes.
Or self-relations, or just our relationships to what we call God. Rather,
Right.
it's kind of all in all. And that's got a certain chaos to it when you open up
Yes.
to the universe, and first
Yes.
to your own world. And that, shall I say something then about
Oh, please.
creation from chaos?
Yes, indeed.
Because that book, Face of the Deep, which you
Mhm.
mentioned, I think what is it, early in this millennium, 2003 perhaps, came out. That's my most biblical book. Well, I guess the apocalypse books, especially second one, are pretty damn biblical. And
Yeah.
I'm a biblical scholar, I'm a constructive theologian, but from that point of view, I've gotten hooked on certain biblical symbols at the beginning, end. And this at the beginning seemed very important to me to take on, because it's so totally, radically, almost unexceptionally misinterpreted
Yes.
in the Christian West. People just assume, and this isn't political, people who are conservative, people who are progressive, whatever, tend theologically to assume God created everything ex nihilo, from nothing. And that creatio ex nihilo, often is used to do good work, of course. But first of all, it's just not there in the Bible. There's nothing of nothing there in those first verses. Nothing. This is when God in the beginning created the heaven and the earth, is how the Hebrew literally translates. And the earth was not formless and void, which that void you can read nothing into. It's not the Hebrew. The Hebrew is tohu vabohu, which is a word for kind of chaotic and unformed. Tohu vabohu, like the word sounds. And darkness was upon the face of the deep. So that's not nothing either. The deep isn't nothing. It's a term that also means oceanic. It's a obviously saltwatery womb-like deep darkness, not nothing. And the spirit is hovering, or the word meheraphet in Hebrew, vibrating, over the face of the waters. This is so far from any creation, from nothing. It's this complex sense of the spirit vibrating there in a pulsation with the vibrations of the waves of this primal oceanic deep, not nothing at all. Maybe, sometimes speculate, it's the deep in the sense of Paul Tillich's abyss, of being itself, or sometimes I'm speculating it's the depth of potentiality of the universe, or even of what it is we sometimes call God. And it's there not after. It doesn't say God created it first. No, there's no nothing ever in that biblical image. So what there is a kind of chaos. So that really got me inspired to develop a creation from chaos, creatio profundus, as an alternative to the creatio ex nihilo. And of course, a creatio ex profundus, out of the depths, out of the unformed chaos, then opens us up to much messier processes in our lives and much messier movements that, in order to bring on change, will bring on also some chaos. But we don't have to be afraid of that and think that everything has to stay ordered. And if we're create some social alternative, it has to be somehow already clear and ordered, or else the whole process will become too chaotic.
Yeah.
No, we have to take risks of serious chaos, because that's how creativity works.
Yeah, this is, I mean, this, like I said, starting out, this is the book that I got into. This was my introduction to Catherine Keller, this book right here. And it came at an important time for me, because I was at the time really trying to think. I mean, I had been, shaped as a theologian and a theological thinker, and cut my teeth on really reading Karl Barth.
Uh-huh.
And then, from Barth, I then ventured into reading, another neo-Orthodox thinker, Dietrich Bonhoeffer. But I was increasingly becoming a bit discontent with where a neo-Orthodox imagination of the theological could take us. So, to your book, and I'm reading this, it struck me as just absolutely, kind of profound. This whole idea of shifting from creatio ex nihilo to, as you say, creatio ex profundis. Or maybe I would like tease it a little bit and say creatio ex mysterium. But again, creation not from this kind of static imagination of the nothing. And even if you wanted to say nihilo as nothing, it begs the question of how you want to conceive of that nothing, right? Sometimes there can be the privileging of thingliness, right, as that which is capturable, that which has clearly defined edges and borders. It's a thing, and because it's clearly defined, I can possess it or have some sort of relationship of superiority and control over it, versus a no thing, the kind of thingliness that exceeds anyone's grasp. And I don't think that when people translate creatio ex nihilo, they mean the latter. They tend to mean the former. And of course, there's a whole politics that goes with that. There's a whole kind of economic imagination that goes with that. So when I was reading your work, I was just struck by how your recasting of creation in terms of a generative chaos versus creation in the ways that we typically think about it. Both the revolution of how we think about God with that, and along with that, the revolution of how we imagine the political with that. That a certain politics follows from this as well. A politics of incompletion, a politics of the open-ended, a politics of sheer entanglement, we might say. A politics in which what we take to be an individual subject actually emerges from and is summoned forth out of this multiplicity, this entanglement, not the other way. We don't begin with the kind of individual first. Actually, the individual, to the extent we even want to talk in those terms, is some sort of gift out of the radical ongoing becoming that is constantly afoot. Am I hearing with you, hearing your rightly? I mean, even if I'm doing my own dancing with it?
Oh, well, no, not just rightly. I mean, you're just bringing a lot of insights to it that I haven't put nearly so well. That's beautiful. And I really like that you translate the ex profundus as ex mysterium, the creation out of the mystery, because that also brings into play the unknowing, which is a deep dimension of theology in the West, and like theologies everywhere, spirituality everywhere, all are in some way founded upon mystery, not upon clear foundations.
Right.
And that unknowing it seems very flagrant, indeed bottomless, in that opening metaphor of the tehom, the deep. So that feels to me really important for our politics, for our relationship to anyone and everyone, that if we're going to work constructively and not destructively, and that means in a way working creatively, then we are going to work with a disciplined sense of our uncertainty.
Yes.
Not of our mere ignorance, not just know nothing. That's just an excuse not to do anything.
Right.
But rather understanding that even the more we know that we don't know. Because the more the more our world opens its complexities to us, its contradictions, its multiplicities, the more we see those, the more we know. With that clarity of what we believe we know, connected to that humble shadow of our, seems really crucial, or else we miss well what you're calling our entanglements, because they're endless. Once we don't see relationships as just this subject object kind of
Right.
interaction between separate entities,
That's
then
right.
we say, yeah, you and I are relating, but what's that? You're a whole community of days going back, to before you were born. And each of those moments of you as Jay is distinct from each other. And each one of those is largely made up of your whole world of relations, all of which is also changing. So if we
Indeed.
begin to open our eyes to what we are as creatures, we see that all the other creatures are somehow entangled in our moment. And that calls us to a broad sense of responsibility, doesn't it? It doesn't diminish our responsibility to each other, even in a one-on-one basis, for us to be speaking responsibly to each other in our responses. But that means that responsibility that we're helping each other respond to,
Yeah.
that all the entangled in, and is you teach better than most, that mystery is grounds for a certain political openness and humility and complexity, but not for passivity or paralysis, or
Right.
for backing off, because I just don't know. No, it's
Yeah.
much that we do know that we need to act, and that action is just going to be all the more wise. If it's aware of its uncertainties. And I'll just finish and say, I think that what we call white civilization, or I prefer white man civilization, has very much grounded on different paradigms of rational certainty, and that's tragic.
Yes.
Paradigms like back with Plato meant to bring on forms of social justice that would serve all best, but something was going wrong from very early on within these imperial forms of civilization. That very noble drive to understand more and better was really conquered by this false aspiration to certitude, and therefore a kind of epistemic control of the object, which enables social and political control
Yeah.
of every kind of other. So that's all to say, I think there's something in Black thought, in African American sensibility, that might be from the start better attuned to the mystery, to the uncertainty, yet without losing very clear confidence about
Yeah.
much is and what must be changed. And I bring that out because it's just something that I sometimes know how to speak about and sometimes feel nervous to articulate, but something about the metaphor of blackness, right? That refers, of course, to race in one paradigm, but also refers to that tehom, that dark depth that.
And you talking. You
It,
talking, Catherine. You're talking good. I'm getting excited. I mean, I'm from Philadelphia, and growing up, me and my buddies on the street that I grew up with, whenever something serious was being said, we would just look at each other and say, apropos your book, that's deep. It's a very deep. It's a deep thing. I mean, as you were talking, I was
the street.
thinking, listen, street philosophers, they were onto it. But I was thinking about, as you were talking, I was thinking about Edward Glissant, and thinking about Glissant's Poetics of Relation, where Glissant says that at the core of Western civilization, sort of like central to its rot that needs to be addressed, is that it imagines it's a form of thought that wants to comprehend. He invokes the French, and then he pulls apart the French term. Don't get me to try and pronounce this French, because my French pronunciation is absolutely terrible. I can read it, but my French is spoken terrible. But he interprets the word for comprehend, comprendre, I believe, and he says basically that this word is the word at the level of thinking that goes with the practices of enslavering. To take knowledge as a taking. And what I hear you're saying, and what Glissant certainly was saying, and what he was trying to advance in a poetics relation, is a whole different paradigm of what it means to even know something. That you don't know it through comprehending it, right? By having some sort of knowledge level mastery, some sort of epistemic mastery over it. Rather, one's relationship to the thing known or that which is known is an ongoing relationship of incompletion where the depths, your point about the depths of each and everything from the cosmic level to the quantum level constantly gives more of itself. And in that giving and in our receiving of that more than, we're constantly more than ourselves as well. And so he tries to build both a poetics of relation and in another book, a philosophy of relation. He tries to actually lay out a philosophy that follows from this poetics. And I hear you moving in this way. Glissant was also keen to understand this as blackness, the blackness that exceeds racialized blackness, the blackness that exceeds that blackness that would be imposed upon people for the sake of capturing.
That's powerful. Thank you, Jay. I love that train of thinking and the chains of thinking and
Yeah.
that it is exposing. But, I hadn't thought of comprehend in that way, that it is a kind of surrounding. I mean, it's prendre. My friend said is good because one of the places we landed when I was a child put me in a my parents couldn't afford the English speaking school. So to comprehend is from prendre, which is take.
To take. Absolutely. Yeah, Glissant was very keen on this.
That's so good. And comprendre, that means also comprehend is connected to apprehend.
Apprehend, absolutely.
Apprehension, but it also is that sense of capturing, which goes enslaving. So that's a really excellent insight into how our whole epistemic framework, our whole basic patterns of understanding as comprehension, as mastery, have led to the mastery of other peoples of the earth, whole populations of humans, not to mention a horrifying proportion of the non-human earth, which won't last terribly much longer at the present pace of our apprehension in both senses. So I'm really glad you bring in that poetics of relation for Glissant, and we can think a little bit about the poetics part too. But let me pause there.
Yeah, totally. I mean, I hope we do get to think about the poetics part because it's bound up with everything that we're talking about. But before we do it, I mean, I just want to just flag it, just for the audience that there's a you've already mentioned the notion of spirituality, and I'm not sure you said this word. I don't think you did, but let's go ahead and make it explicit. There's a certain kind of mysticism that's going on here too, right? Where mysticism isn't that fuzzy wuzzy thing that we often are made to think that it is, but rather it speaks to an orientation that respects and indeed embraces the mysterium, the depth of things. It's an orientation to living. Now, again, I said fuzzy wuzzy. It's not that kind of loosey goosey fuzzy wuzzy thing that we often think about as spirituality or mysticism, but rather mysticism is about that other book that you wrote, The Cloud of Unknowing. Right? If one way of knowing is through the operation of taking, comprehending as apprehending as seizing, in Cloud of Unknowing, you start to try and break in another direction. In a certain conversation with the pseudo Dionysius and the Cloud of Unknowing and that whole tradition. Would you mind just maybe just sort of saying something about that? Because there's an arc that emerges through your work that's pushing in this direction.
It's true. I think from rather early there's a sort of mystical undertow to my thinking that is a mysticism that cuts against a lot of what we call mysticism, that is the sort of spirituality that wants to disconnect us from materiality and from this is a mysticism oriented to that deep mystery of of the darkness of all that in its immensity and complexity and multiplicity and sheer depth exceeds our knowing, and that we need to keep conscious our knowing of that of the unknowing, because the mystery otherwise begins to trip us up. We just get into things we're not prepared for and can't deal with that. We're not prepared for not being prepared, as opposed to living with more of a humble sense of the insufficiency of our various masteries. But for me, the mystical tradition of Pseudo-Dionysius and running up through that Nicholas of Cusa, Renaissance figure 500 years ago, I also wrote a lot about in the book. It's a mysticism that's not at all about escape from the material world. It is a deep dive into the source and the very flow of the depths of the material world. And with Pseudo-Dionysius, that beautiful metaphor of the dark brilliance, I think he wasn't anticipating American race issues, but I can't help but let that, which also is translated as the luminous darkness. I think I occasionally am making the connection to racial darkness, but that epistemic luminous darkness then in Cusa, interestingly, opens into a cosmology that I have argued at some length is the first in the Western world to systematically develop the notion of everything in the universe connected to everything else. It's almost unthinkable in his time, because that's early modernity, when the sense of things being separate or what's
what are Cusa's dates, by the way? Cusa is what are his dates?
He's in most of his writing from about 14.
That's what I thought.
Okay, for another 30 years, he's writing. Yeah.
So he's basically early 15th century, right?
15th century. Yeah.
Okay, I got a reason for asking that.
His book is De Docta Ignorantia.
That's right.
The known ignorance, that is a kind of knowledge that knows its own ignorance, and a kind of ignorance that includes a certain knowingness. That's what he's teaching.
Absolutely. This is profound to me. And again, it's, so much is coming back to me about what inspired me and energized me in reading your work, those connections that you were making. The reason I asked this is because it's a curious thing. And I'm thinking someone's had to have written on this, but I don't think there's much written on this. But the historical convergence, let's just put it this way, maybe the adjacency of what Nicholas of Cusa was doing in the early 15th century with often is translated on learned ignorance in that text. And he was a bit on the outs, he was not warmly embraced by the normative Christian theological doctors of the church.
No, he got away with it because his good friend back in university times, when they wrote in university together, happened to be the person who became the Pope. So he had a little wiggle room.
Yeah, so he was able to wiggle. But certainly his reception, his reception is not Thomas Aquinas' reception. Let's put it that way.
Against him by a bishop at that very time. Yeah.
That's exactly right. And yet, at the same time that Nicholas of Cusa is doing this stuff, I'm thinking of maybe a little bit later down the line when St. John of the Cross is doing his own thing, right? Teresa Avila, these kind of dissident, kind of to the side mystics. At the same time that they're doing this, you have also the rise of the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade. These things are happening at the same time. And you have a mode of thinking that's arising, that's taking serious the mystery of the deep, of the oceanic, right? At the same time that the violence that is happening vis-a-vis the oceanic. And so you have that. And then on the other hand, right in the same historical conjuncture, you have these other dissident, wayward modes of thought that are also kind of invested in the oceanic as well. You sort of see the kind of thing I'm trying to think about what obtains when we try to think those things together, right? The brutality of the transatlantic and the Black Atlantic and the slave trade and so forth. And yet at the same time, there were other forms of thinking emerging right in that conjuncture that when you think them with what was happening, in Christian empire at that time, it's also a pushback and a critique of these new dimensions of Western ideological capitalist practice.
I think that's a really important reading of that coinciding of the slave trade of early modernity and then these alternative modalities, rather than thinking they're somehow expensive of the same thing.
Right.
As you're talking, I was thinking perhaps what's happening is that modernity is beginning to manifest itself, and there is the emergence of what would then be known as this Cartesian sense of the subject that knows over and against the object is known. Again, the comprehension with its enslaving implications that's developed, that kind of episteme is developing and is enabling white civilization to become increasingly self-conscious as such, and in doing to perform a whole new level of enslavement as it crosses the Atlantic, especially. But that's developing out of that awareness. But perhaps then on the fringe of that awareness is a strong response against it.
That's
We're
right.
from the mystics, though they at that early point aren't directly seeing how it's going to get deployed. Though with Cusa, there is some really intriguing reflection on the difference between a politics of extreme external relations and dominance and
Yes, yes, yes.
democracy, but of more cooperative relationality.
Yes. Well, I want to be sensitive to the time here, so I want to maybe move us along just a little bit more because we could keep dwelling on this. But what I would love to begin to shift to do is we've talked about your rereading of the Genesis story, the story of creation, and what I take to be its absolute importance and profundity and its implications for relationality. I take you to have in your own way, even given us a way to rethink what we even mean when we say God. Right? There's the word God, the idea of God, is not some neutral concept. How one conceives of God matters. And what you've done in your work is tried to give us an imaginary of God as fundamentally and absolutely relational. So, and it's beautiful. Then, on the other hand, you've given us writings from Apocalypse Then and Now up through Facing Apocalypse around John's, the last book of the Bible, the letter of John from the Isle of Patmos, in which we get the story of the end times. There's this book I picked up and started reading a little bit, and we'll get into more this summer, that argues that we've found it easier to imagine the end of the world rather than the end of capital. I do think we've found it hard to imagine the end of capital. I'm not sure I believe with the first part of that claim, though, that we found it easy to imagine the end of the world, particularly if one takes the end of the world to also be the end of capital, as I do. So I would love for you to just sort of say a bit about what you're doing in your apocalyptic meditations.
Yeah, thank you. It's an odd leap and maybe a spiral that I thought seems to have taken from the alpha of meditation on beginnings,
to the omega now.
where I've had to come back and back to the apocalypse. What I always do when I come back to the apocalypse is repeat, apocalypsis does not mean the end of the world. That's not a biblical concept.
Yeah.
It's not
Say
there.
more.
Yeah,
Yes.
in the Bible, there are lots of big endings. There are endings of cities and of whole civilizations, certainly foreseen in the book of Revelation, a kind of collapse of the civilization that's symbolized by the perpetual, shall I say, of the great whore of Babylon, representing the global economy, clearly in the relation with the beast, shall I say, the most powerful man in the world. I didn't say anything about Musk and Trump.
Right.
But that sense of a kind of collapse of the civilization, of the fusion of an oppressive global power and its economics is certainly envisioned in the book of Revelation. But that's never seen as the world.
Yes.
Seen as what from his point of view, is an advanced civilization of the future that will collapse on its own with a little divine help. And that opens up the space for a radical alternative. So it's been important to me because of the influence of John of Patmos' Book of Revelation. Mm-hmm. It has been important to me to return and try to present an actually biblically more faithful view. A lot of biblical scholars do this, but then they tend to be speaking to other biblical scholars. I tried to speak a little bit more broadly because it's important that we get the word out among Christians and among secular folk, among atheists, that whatever you think about the Bible, let alone its last book, let's not misunderstand it. Let's not misinterpret it as predicting the end of the world. Right. It's predicting in increasing levels of internal contradiction and finally collapse. It's the whore and the beast that turn on each other in that scene. It's not that just brings it down. I mean, the divine hosts are there to help transition along. So I've wanted to use that mythical imagery as a way of saying it's not that the end of the world is coming. And if you think the Book of Revelation helps to say, oh yes, it is, but that's actually wrong. Mm-hmm. It is likely that the civilization that we are inhabiting is not able to sustain itself much longer, partly because it is unsustainable for masses of the more vulnerable human beings, and perhaps now more drastically and evidently than ever, it's not sustainable in the ecological sense. It's eating up the resources of the world. If it weren't doing that, I guess say that all the injustices can eventually correct themselves. And we do have, of course, there are a lot of processes for social justice that have been going on in the world for centuries, and perhaps mounting in many senses. But no, at this pace, there's just not time, because those social injustices are all tied together with the economic injustices that are like that great slut with all of her products listed, using up the stuff of the world, turning the materiality of the earth into consumer commodities. And it's being used up, and the wastes are mounting up under the earth, in the ocean, and in the atmosphere. And we don't have terribly many years left unless we make dramatic changes. And I think environmentalists agree. If we can come together and make radical changes in our economic and material ways of operating, and if we can do it within about a decade, it's possible we could really stave off the worst of the climate change and the global warming that's on the horizon. And so there's, but guess what happened in this election, and what does that do to our hope? But, I guess the dark hope is that it'll get bad enough that enough people wake up soon enough to make enough of a difference to save enough of the world.
Yeah. Well, I want to just underscore for the auditors, for the listeners, what you said. I mean, and if I had a digital highlighter, I suppose if I mess around with the computer, I could find one. But if I had at my quick disposal some sort of digital highlighter that you get from Staples or something, I just want to highlight just what you said here about the Book of Revelation, John's Patmos writing, that you're saying that this is not a document about the end of the world. It's a document, and the way I wrote it is, it's a document about the ending of particular civilizational and political projects. That no civilizational and political project is in and of itself eternal and should not be made to be equal to the world as such, or even the earth. Political projects and civilizational projects can come and go, and we know they have. But the earth, the world, has this capacity to endure. And we've got to think about the fragility, the finitude of civilizational projects. And when we do, I wrote this down from what you said, spaces of radical alternatives can then light themselves up. They become revealed. And apocalypto, to unveil, is how occasions of crises unveil potentialities that exceed those crises. That's how I've been reading your work on Apocalypse. And I was like, okay, she messed me up already on Genesis. Now she's messing me up on Apocalypse, on Omega. I mean, but it's an Octavia Butler point, right? Octavia Butler, the writer, whose work is very much invested in, and some have argued, and I'm actually persuaded by it, that a number of her novels can be read as this kind of prophecy of an authoritarianism to come that we might now be in. But her writings move in this direction. And there are a number, I'm thinking of NourbeSe Phillips's poetry moves in this direction. But it's this point that you're making about, recrafting our readerly imagination, what it means to read this text and what the text actually unveils for us. It unveils, in a certain sense, that's the political power of the text. If civilizations want to comprehend and apprehend and close our imagination to alternative possibilities, what is disclosed by John, according to your work, is a release of the imagination to potentialities and alternatives. That's the message of the book.
Yeah, no, you put it perfectly. And that word apocalypsis means literally unveiling is very important.
Mm-hmm.
It's a sexy word. It was used mainly about the unveiling of the bride on her wedding night alone with, but it doesn't have what we mean by apocalyptic associations, the original meaning of apocalypsis. But that unveiling is a disclosing, not a closing.
Right.
We just have to keep repeating that. This is not about closure. This is about opening of radical alternatives.
Yes. I mean, this is so powerful. In fact, I giggled when you said what you said about apocalypsis, apocalypto as a kind of unveiling. And I chuckled, but then I said, wait a minute, there's something to this, right? I mean, there's an eroticism that travels along with this word. And here erotics in the sense of desire, right? And one might argue that part of what civilizational political projects often want to capture and harness and control is precisely desire for more, desire for alternatives, and so on and so forth. So, I mean, if you actually can go down this erotic vein and talk about how the stakes of this document, this text, is to release our desire for something else, our attraction towards something else.
Yeah. That's so important to get that meaning of eros, that it's not just about sexual desire, though that's important, but a desire that goes all the way down. I believe in my political theology of the earth. I do come to a discussion of God as divine eros, don't I?
I believe you do.
Yeah, and that sense of the divine eros is picking up on the process theological sense that God is not an omnipotent agent in control of the universe and able to predict all the outcomes because he controls it. Rather, as that view has developed, what we call God is a kind of lure to transformation, a lure of possibility. Indeed, it is an eros.
Yes.
That calls, that attracts, and we can reject it.
Yes.
Can abuse it or manipulate it, use it just a little bit, or we can practice as a faith that is opening us to what is opening up moment by moment as possible.
Yes, yes. I mean, this is so beautiful. I want to, and I said off air to you something that now I will say live, that I sort of increasingly read you as a poet, a kind of theological poet. And I'm struck by one of the chapters, I mean, many of the chapters in your Political Theology of the Earth book, but one of the chapters in particular I was struck by. Am I going to get the chapter title right? I have it marked out. It is the chapter in which you begin with Ed Roberson's poetry. Yes. You begin with Ed Roberson, and Ed Roberson is a cherished poet for me. Right up there with, people like NourbeSe Phillip and Nate Mackey. And you begin the chapter, of course, you can never find it exactly when you're looking for it. But you begin this chapter talking through or building from one of Ed's poems. Yeah, it's chapter 2 called Earth. Climate of closure, matter of disclosure, apocalypsis again, right? climate of closure, matter of disclosure. And you begin with a line from one of Ed's poems that I love so much. I risked trying to teach, from Ed's poetry, and I'll keep trying. That's all I'll say. It's so gorgeous and so beautiful and powerful. But you start with Ed, and I wanted to ask you, maybe to say something about Ed's poetry. In fact, before we get to it, though, I don't want to lose the thought, because once we go down here, I know we're going to go down a line. So I wanted to just refer to something that I wrote when you were talking about the luminous darkness that I didn't mention, and then we're going to get to Ed's and how Ed's poetry has influenced your and has left its own stamp on your own kind of thinking about the ecological and the condition of the earth. You mentioned about I think it was in the context of Nicholas of Cusa and Pseudo Dionysius about the darkness and the oceanic and the void and so forth. I mean, of course, Horton Spillers also plays around with the oceanic and thinking about Black life in oceanic terms, and as inciting a certain kind of fear and trepidation, particularly among those who would seek to comprehend and own those who they enslaved upon the face of the deep. But what it got me thinking about when you gave that phrase, the luminous darkness, it struck me that, Howard Thurman has a collection of his writings and some poetry in it as well, titled The Luminous Darkness. And I mean, I read it, and it's worth me going back to it, because Thurman is taken to be, not just taken to be, I mean, he himself, spoke of himself in terms of a mystic. And it would be interesting to think about Howard Thurman, the story of Howard Thurman, some people have written about it, but it invites more reflection, because, Thurman is the one that's behind Martin Luther King. Thurman is the one that's behind Jesse Jackson. He's almost like the spiritual heartbeat behind what we now call the civil rights movement. All of these people are going to Howard Thurman, and they're talking to him, and he's giving them their direction. But he's got this deep spiritualist, mystic sensibility, where he's highly attuned, not to mysticism as the fuzzy wuzzy, but mysticism as the luminous darkness, the unseizable depth that can open up new possibilities even for this country. And he infuses these civil rights workers, the ones on the front line, are carrying the Thurman luminous darkness mystic beat within their heart. And so again, it invites this potential constructive reflection between a Nicholas of Cusa, a Pseudo Dionysius, a John of the Cross, a Teresa Avila, this tradition of an alternate mode of thinking and knowing and being with each other that's associated with these mystics who are doing their work right in the midst of all of this violence that's happening. And then you got a Thurman who comes out of a tradition that has him speaking this way. So, I just wanted to throw that out there, because it just again strikes me that Black thought is not just, though it does involve, a cataloging of the great things that those who have been made to be Black in modernity have done. Of course, it's a cataloging of that. But there's something deeper than just the cataloging. There's an alternate orientation of what it means to be with the world, to be with the earth, to be with each other. And that Thurman phrase, luminous darkness, is converging with your work in some interesting ways, it seems to me.
Well, and I really have to take the risk of exploring that much more explicitly. I think I had some fear of being read as appropriating racial blackness for my mystical Blackness. So I was overly cautious in making some of the connections. Once one understands that the brilliant darkness is brilliant, not through some sheer unknowing.
Right. It's the Victor Anderson point, right? Our colleague and friend Victor Anderson, where in Beyond Ontological Blackness, for me, I think that's his greatest text that he wrote. And as he continues to do his work to this day, but he makes that point in Beyond Ontological Blackness, that there is a Blackness that exceeds the Blackness that whiteness created. That's his formulation.
So important, and
it's so crucial
that whiteness created historically in whole imposed modes of social existence, and conceptually in how the notion of Blackness travels around. So
and then at the same time, there's a Blackness that exceeds that, right? That is non-capturable even within the efforts to capture it.
And an endless recreation of Blackness.
Absolutely.
Needed. And of course, that doesn't make for some simply ordered notion of what's Black and what's white.
Right.
simply ordering is sort of what white civilization has been about, keeping things transparent, sort of obvious, exposed in the light in that way, not taking the shadows and the shades
Indeed.
into account. And so, your response in Black Anarchy is crucial. It's not about bringing all order down or simple order, but a resistance to any self-imposing order and a resistance to the oppressions that orders almost invariably have been creating, and to that sense of arcos,
Yes.
of the origin, and therefore the origin myth, to go back to and why we have to continually
Totally.
that arcos in order to undo it and reinterpret. Yeah, so I find that your work on Black Anarchy is crucial in undoing the imposed orders, and in language that involves a certain poiesis, a certain poetics. I'm glad you're bringing that out. If I have a moment to add something more about the poiesis.
Sure, please.
The poiesis is an interesting term, and one speaks also of theopoetics, which prefer to think I'm doing than theology. But that poiesis does refer certainly to poetry, but it also has the older sense of making from the Greek. That in a sense, poiesis is praxis. It's making, it's doing, and its original meaning. But it's so interesting that there's an aesthetic bound up in that making. And I think that's something that Black culture knows so much about. A feeling of the blues and of a jazzy coming over me, but that transformation, it can't happen without a certain rhythmic pulsation that opens us at once to the unknown and to the beautiful, and so motivates the transformation, the beautiful that's already there in our fragmented communications, and beautiful that's so much poiesis takes very poetic form. Specifically, I just bumped into another poem by Ed Roberson very recently,
Which one was this?
It's called Black Earth Song. And,
Yes.
And I have it here. That might be fun to share.
Yeah, maybe because I had a selection from Ed's work, but maybe we can listen to what you selected, because if you already have one, that would be great. But before we do that, if you don't mind, I want to read this poem in my morning practice. As a part of starting my day. I have certain rituals that I do. One entails reading from this book. Some of the viewers and auditors may know of, and you yourself may know of, and if you don't, you want to know of this book. It's called Black Liturgies, Prayers, Poems, and Meditations for Staying Human by co-author Riley. I'm going to hold it up and I'll put it also in the description, but this is the book, Black Liturgies. And I was reading from the section on artistry this morning to start my day before I got into my own writing session. And I was taken, and it comes to this point about poiesis as making. That you were just made. It's a poem on Bill Withers. I don't know if you know the musician Bill Withers. Ain't No Sunshine When She's Gone, Grandma's Hands. He's got this whole beautiful kind of collection of songs that he did. And he's passed away since, but she has this meditation. It's a very brief poem. And she reflects on the moment in Bill Withers's song, Ain't No Sunshine When She's Gone. And there's this moment when Bill Withers, he's a guitarist, he's playing the guitar, and it's got this beautiful sound that he's got. And the notes, each note he plucks, and he allows each note to just span out until its own quietness. His eyes are closed, and you can go on YouTube and you can find it. I mean, who knows, when I edit and chop this up, I may get that slice and drop it in here so the audience will know what I'm talking about. And Bill Withers is wearing this orange sweater. I mean, he's got an afro. He's like 1970s, he's got an afro. Co-author reflects on this for the moment of poiesis. And she says this. First, she begins by, the poem is called Bill Withers. And she opens by saying, in a burnt orange turtleneck, waits until after the last note to open his eyes. Right. When you look at the YouTube, you can see everything she's talking about. When I read that, I was like, she's talking about that performance. Then she says this: old gray whistle test, 1972, sweat dripping down like his afro is raining, eyes closed, he's lost, but not in himself, in what came from him. Then she quotes the line after the notes go away. Bill Withers has a line that he sings, and she italicizes it. I know, I know, I know, I know, I know, I know. And then she comes out of the quote from the line and she continues the poem. I know what? That his making is making him.
Beautiful.
Eyes closed, waiting to be born, the sound contracting, a map unfolding. And so I was meditating on this morning about this knowing. What does she see Bill Withers knowing? What is it making? What is this making going on? Right. And the making is, I hear it in two registers, right? That he's making this artistry. It's making him, which is to say it's compelling him. It's making him do something. It's taking him into his own kind of ecstasy. It's compelling him, it's moving, but also it's making as in remaking him. He's undergoing his own making as a result of having made this artwork. I mean, and it's that dynamic of making. I mean, when you said poiesis as making, I couldn't help but think, I was like, yeah, I think that's what Cole Arthur is thinking about in this poem.
Yeah, I love that connection. And even just I know. Isn't it interesting? Yeah. It's repeated. It no longer means certainty at all.
Right. The fact that it's repeated doesn't mean certainty. Absolutely.
It's more like responding to something
you
understand. I know.
Yeah, it's sort of like, like when you're talking and I noticed I'm nodding my head a lot, and I was like, yeah, I get it. I know.
Certitude.
Yeah, so it's almost this homiletic dimension to it as well. This like kind of conversation that is happening, right? It's not an I know as if I'm grasping, but it's an I know as in I'm in the conversation. I mean, we sometimes say I feel you rather than I know as in I feel you, not I know as in I own you or I own what you're saying. But it's like I feel you. I'm with you. Yeah. But I love this point that you're making. I know as in like the repetition of the I know lets you know that there's a different type of knowing going on.
I love that too. Definitely the opposite. I comprehend you. I apprehend.
Totally. Well, listen, did you want to read this Ed Roberson poem? You got me intrigued now. I certainly want to hear it.
I have to say it's a way of hooking in the whole ecological dimension.
Yes, please do.
Of our discussion and bringing that in as, the context in which we make and unmake and remake ourselves. It's all more our whole embodied material world. So anyway.
What collection is it out of? Which of his collections is it out of?
I'm not sure. I found it in notes of mine and I didn't have a good source back. It's called the Black Earth Song. It would be easy to take a minute, I think, on Google, but it's Black Earth Song. Mine are the rainbow arms of the horizon around you, stroking you forward to the center of the sky, out of the desert, the Arctics, the seas, the beds of anything you are on. Mine are the arms, the ends of all the earth you need. I am for.
Yes, beautiful.
And we don't figure out who the I is in that I am, who is for us.
I mean, probably whatever that I is, whoever that I is, it's more and less than one at the same time, right? This is not the singular I. This is some sort of magnanimous. It's multitude. Yeah, I myself was going to just point to what you quote Ed as well in the epigraph to A Political Theology of the Earth in chapter 2. And this is from To See the Earth Before the End of the World. People are grabbing at the chance to see the earth before the end of the world. The world's death, piece by piece, each longer than we. I would love for you to say a bit more about how a poetry like this kind of animates which.
Well, it's a beautiful example of what poetry does, of its poiesis. It seems to me is bringing deep motivation to impossible struggles to the planet. But it's doing that by breaking beauty into every step of the process. he says in that poem also, our small human extinction. It says something about that after people were large and small, people chasing glaciers and retreat up their valleys, and this watched ice with speed made invisible. So thinking about, of course, the speed of glacier melt and rushing to observe and to track. And a subtle collapse, he says, of time between large and our small human extinction. So he's wanting us to realize that everything eventually goes into extinction, but ours is small. It can come very, very fast, being a very small portion of the larger life cycle of the rest of the planet. And of course, he's calling us to take responsibility for this, not in pedantic or moralistic terms, but he says, doesn't he, at the end, I think I have that quoted right there, that, I have this. All that once chased us and we chased to a balance, chasing back, tooth for spear, knife for claw. That was a balance at some point once. Now locks us in this grip. We just now see our own lives taken by taking them out. Hunting the bear, we hunt the glacier with the changes come of that.
Yes, with the changes come of that choice.
It's a powerful warning, isn't it? But it's poetic. It's opening a mysterious collage of beauty and history.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. I mean, I'm looking at the poem now myself, and just how even spacing works in the poem, that even as the poet is narrating our condition, there's also these gaps, these spaces, these pockets right inside of what's happening that bespeak potentialities even in the midst of what's being narrated.
Yes.
Right? It's so powerful. And then of course there's that poem, To See the Earth Before the End of the World, opens part one, and then there's We Look at the World to See the Earth, that poem that's like bookending it, that complements it at the end of part one, which is also like equally profoundly moving in its own right. We look at the world to see the earth, at the silver pedestaled globe to see the grounds. We see what we've done with it, what it has to do with. We see our face bent to a surface. But what of the world is seen in looking at the earth, any more than the world's measure of minute to a rock looking, but seeing gets a return, begets return, gets returned. The river comes back, the salmon. We look upon the world to see ourselves in the brief moment that we are of the earth, a small fern in a crevice of the cliff face, to see ourselves in the brief moment that we are of the earth, to see the earth before the end of the world. The world is mortality. The earth goes beyond us, is ours of cosmos, is our hour of cosmos. It's what I mean, there's so much going on there.
Such prophetic teaching.
It's just so much going on there. But one of the things that I just sort of like about your work in poetics, or as you say, in theopoetics, is this releasing of the word. And in a certain sense, as I'm like going to now try and pull us and start to land the plane, because we've been going for a minute here and I want to really honor and respect your time. In the beginning was the word. And there's a sense in which with poetry and poetics, word itself, our language, in the forms of world that we've built with our language, needs to be released.
It needs to be released.
It needs to be released. And I'm sort of hearing so much of your work doing work similar to what, say, a person like Ed Roberson does as a formal poet, if you want to put it that way, to release the word so that the word released can potentiate worlds released.
Amen. That word released can be released to create perhaps new worlds.
New worlds.
And maybe not ex nihilo, but maybe even out of the chaos.
Indeed.
in which we find ourselves. But maybe maybe the great new creation.
Yeah. It reminds me, your work also reminds me of, do you know the biblical scholar Vincent Wimbush?
Yes.
Yeah. Vincent And you probably didn't know this. Vincent has been involved in this project for the longest, an important project on scripturalization, and has argued that our approaches to the Bible have aided and abetted what he calls a certain kind of incarceration. He calls that scripturalization. Scripture, through certain practices of reading, through certain practices of ownership,
Wow.
has been a vehicle of our having been inscripted, enclosed.
Inscripted, yes.
Inscripted, scripturalized. The script part of scripture also works at the language level of potentially inscripting us, capturing us. And he wants to like narrate that process, its relationship to racial capitalism, earth destruction, so on and so forth. And it strikes me that, from your reading of Genesis up to your reading of John of Patmos's writings on the Apocalypse, your reading of the earth, you're drawing on people like Ed Roberson and others that we didn't even get to in your work, that all of this also seems to me to be in the service of trying to release the imagination, and that the stakes of that release are the stakes of an alternative politicality altogether.
Altogether. And one that has to tug us all.
Yeah, indeed.
In some difficult, chaotic, and not hopeless new way.
Yes. Well, listen, again, I'm going to go ahead and end it here, if that's okay with you. It's been a long conversation. My digital thing here says an hour and 25 minutes. So how the time moves. I'm so grateful for you, for your work, and for, being able to carve out a little bit of time for this conversation. It has truly been great for me. And I believe that is the case as well, and will be the case as well for the auditors, for the listeners. Thank you, Catherine, for coming by and chopping it up with me for a little bit.